We begin with a conversation about efforts on the Hill to regulate AI. For that, please welcome Representative Jimmy Gomez from California, and joining him here on stage is journalist Jean Meserve.
Welcome. Great to have you with us.
Good morning.
So we're going to talk about marrying up artificial intelligence with cameras, which gives us facial recognition, a technology which law enforcement argues is a great tool for good, but privacy advocates have a different point of view. Congressman, you have had your own personal experience with facial recognition. Tell us about that.
Well, last summer, the ACLU conducted a test with the photographs of members of Congress. And those tests showed a lot of misidentification and matching with different mugshots. And I remember the day because my comms director got a phone call from somebody in the media and said, hey, the ACLU conducted a test. Your boss was in it. Do you have a comment? And he asked for the results. And they're like, well, we don't have the results. Is there a comment? So we ended up, he came and told me, and I'm going to let me guess. It was mostly people of color and minorities that were misidentified. And later on, we found out that was exactly the case. Not only myself, but John Lewis, mostly members who were in the Congressional Hispanic Caucus or the CBC or the Congressional Black Caucus were the ones that were misidentified. So it wasn't a shock to me, and I think it's because earlier that year, I went to a South by Southwest, my first time in South by Southwest, and I went to a workshop on diversity in tech. And some people were making the argument the lack of diversity in tech shows up in the products. And it kind of stuck with me, so when I saw it, a firsthand result, I was thinking, wow, this could be very, very bad, especially when technology is being integrated with body cameras or potentially and the use of that technology with law enforcement. What does it mean for our communities?
Well, what does it mean? Where do you think it could lead?
Well, one of the things we know for a fact, that we've seen it, that interactions with the minority communities, if you're black or brown, you're more likely to end up in a situation that is life-changing, right? Or cost you your life. So if this misidentification increases the likelihood that you're going to get stopped, then that's a big concern because it can change the impact my constituents. It can impact countless Americans in a very negative way.
Worst case scenario?
Death. You know, when you get pulled over by a police officer in the minority community, there is a lot of concern. I've had friends when they get pulled over, they stick their hands out the window, right? So we know it's a real life serious consequence if things go wrong. So worst case scenario, somebody gets pulled over, they're misidentified because they thought it was this person. Maybe it's somebody that's, they're looking for somebody that's committed murder. They get pulled over, the interaction goes wrong, and that person dies.
The tech industry says we can fix that. Do you have confidence that they will?
Not yet. And the reason why is that I started asking questions and sending out around a letter last year, just trying to get answers to just some basic questions. And we've been working with the ACLU to ask these questions, and they just haven't been that forthright. They've come to the office, and I'll be very honest. I was last year in the House, I was the 435th member in seniority. I was sort of like, so out of 435, I was like dead last.
It improves.
Yeah,
it does improve.
Now I'm 336. And I was on natural resources, which is not a very powerful committee, and I was on oversight in the minority. In the minority, not a very powerful committee. So the responses were kind of lacking, but the minute we switched to being in the majority and being on oversight, which is a very powerful committee when you're in the majority, and then on Ways and Means, all of a sudden their response has changed. They started coming back with meetings, coming back and trying to answer our questions, but they're still lacking. But I still think that they're coming from California. We got to ask the tough questions. Like, are we stumbling into the darkness and not understanding what we're walking into?
And do you think we are?
I think we are. I think we are. So it is up to, I think, policymakers to ask those tough questions and then to have a debate in public if there should be limitations on the use of that technology.
So you've talked about the discriminatory aspects of this. Are you also concerned about the privacy implications here?
Of course.
What's being collected? By whom? How's it being used? How long is it being kept?
Yeah, one of the things, I served in the California State Legislature for 4.5 years, and I was the chair of appropriations, but that committee would really dealt with money, but it dealt with all pieces of legislation. And one of the big debates when I was there is the use of body cameras, and oftentimes with law enforcement. And the questions are the same. Who owns the data? Where is it stored? What can be done with it? Who can review it? It's the same thing when it comes to facial recognition. Who is actually the owner of that data, right? Who can they sell it? How do they use it? Where is it stored? What happens if there's a breach? A lot of questions that have to be asked and answered. Right now, I think we're kind of in the wild, wild west of facial recognition where, sort of anything goes. And there's some companies that are out there that see no limitations. Other companies that understand that, we got to tread lightly on this issue.
And we look at what's happening in other countries. There's been a lot of publicity about China and how China is using facial recognition to control its Uyghur minority population. Do you have fear that something like that could actually happen here in the United States?
I think there's a real fear that there could be a chilling effect on people's right to exercise their First Amendment rights, right? The right to protest, the right to assemble, not only on the left but on the right. And I think that might be the nexus where there's agreement between Republicans and Democrats on how should this new technology be used and what should be the limitations. We're going to have a hearing on the Oversight Committee on Wednesday on this issue. It's going to be the first hearing that we've held on this issue. I asked for it back in February, and the reason why the committee agreed to do it is that it is a bipartisan issue, that the Republicans actually wanted to work on this issue as well. So it's not just Democrats, it's Republicans alike. And also, I want to be very clear. I'm not anti-technology. I'm not anti-innovation. But I understand that we have to balance people's civil liberties with security. And a new technology that's emerging, how it used does matter.
San Francisco has taken a dramatic step here and said, whoa, not here, not with government agencies. Is that the right step for that city to take? And should other cities, states, and federal government follow suit?
Yeah, I'm not surprised San Francisco did that. I was in...
Because
dealing with some tech companies, there seems to be an arrogance that they can fix anything and that they don't have to be responsive to elected officials. And that they can kind of slow walk us and the issue will go away. I had that situation with the tech company, and I knew that this issue wouldn't go away just by my gut, because I've been in an elected office for a while, and I've seen issues kind of percolate, and all of a sudden the public awareness of that issue increases, and as it increases, so does the awareness of the elected officials. I was visited by my former colleagues in the state legislature from California, and they asked me, what are you working on? I talked about a variety of issues, and I mentioned facial recognition. And they said, oh yeah, we're looking at that as well. So I knew that was on people's radar. And when companies do not respond or they don't get sufficient answers to our questions, is there an inherent bias in your data set? Is there, just answering a bunch of questions and they're not responsive, then elected officials take a step. And that's why I'm not surprised.
Is a ban a step too far?
Not yet. I don't think it's necessarily, I don't think it is. And I think that is sometimes sometimes companies, by their lack of action, determine their own fate. And that's what I think happened in San Francisco. In the California legislature, Phil Ting introduced a bill that will prohibit the integration of facial recognition technology with police body cameras, right? So we're going to see that it's going to happen more and more across the country, California, and I think that the companies are going to have to decide how they respond.
Well, the tech companies themselves have said, regulate us, set up some guardrails for us. Are they sincere?
I hope they're sincere. I know, I think it was Microsoft that asked for that. At the same time, oftentimes when they ask for guardrails, when you go to put guardrails, they're like, those are a little too narrow. Can you widen them out a little bit? Their tune changes a little bit. So we'll see. But I'm glad that they recognize some companies are taking steps, understanding that there has to be some oversight on the use of that technology, and they have a responsibility. But not all companies see that.
Do you have some thoughts on where those guardrails should be placed?
I think right now, I would think it would be appropriate not to use the technology when it comes to law enforcement. And that's because of how it can be used. There's been examples. I read an article about the New York Police Department, a witness say that a suspect looked like Woody Harrelson, so they took his photo and uploaded it to their database in order to find that person. They also other police departments took police sketches, right? Took a police sketch and then put it into the database to look for a suspect. And I'm not sure if people know, but eyewitness testimony is often some of the weakest. Like the studies have consistently shown is the weakest when it comes to finding the right individual. So there's a lot of concerns, especially if you can put a drawing into a system and think that that looks like a person and that's how they're going to find them.
But there are other examples where it has been a valuable tool for law enforcement, and it has helped them find criminals. Happened not far from here with the Annapolis newspaper shooting.
Yeah.
Facial recognition helped them find this individual.
Yeah, and there is there is examples of that, but people have to decide, like I said, how much of their liberties are they willing to give up, right? And if Ted Bundy's been on Netflix quite a bit. Imagine if we had facial recognition back in the day, and we could have found Ted Bundy a lot quicker. Would people would have supported that? I think they would have, but I think that at the same time, when it comes to this technology, you got to understand that it is still flawed.
Aren't there ways to establish boundaries that where individuals are consenting to having their images used, where there's transparency about how they're being used, about how long they're being held, that would allow this to still be a tool that law enforcement and government could use?
Yeah, there is, but there has to be a debate about that, and the debate is not occurring.
It's not even on Capitol Hill.
No, not really. A little bit. You see Brian Schatz and another person, I think, introduced legislation. It's starting to occur because we're having that first hearing and oversight on Wednesday. It's a big concern. I think that not only policymakers are concerned, shareholders are starting to be concerned. Amazon shareholders are going to have a vote on Wednesday if they should continue down this road or not.
Do you think the regulation, if there is regulation, should be done at the federal level? Should it be done state? Should it be done locally?
If Congress fails to act, it will be done at the state level. I come from California. I don't try to say that California shouldn't put restrictions on facial recognition, but they will act, and the states have a right to act, and the municipalities have a right to act if Congress fails to take appropriate measures.
Does Congress have the smarts to do it? No offense to you, but we have all witnessed some hearings on the Hill that have displayed to us in shocking clarity the lack of technical knowledge of some members of Congress.
Yeah, no, it's one of the things I've always said is that members of Congress, elected officials, don't know everything. And as long as you recognize that your limitations on what you know and what you don't know, and you rely on staff and experts and different advocates to help guide the discussion, that's where we want to go. One of the problems I always say, the difficulties of trying to regulate tech, is what happens when the text changes, right? What happens when it's no longer...
It evolves very quickly.
Yeah, and your legislation is static. So that is one of the biggest challenges when dealing with emerging technologies is how you develop a regulatory system that promotes innovation, but then has those guardrails to protect people's civil liberties. Why is it, and this is a good question, is like, why is it when it comes to autonomous vehicles, we've taken a very cautious path forward, right? Autonomous vehicles, and I think it's because it's obvious, an autonomous vehicle, if it crashes, it takes out a person, right? It can kill them instantly. Facial recognition, it doesn't seem that serious, but it is serious. And the consequences can be just as dramatic as somebody getting hit by a driverless car. So it's still something that we're struggling with, but I think it's the discussion is emerging.
Another question is, if you regulate, what are the penalties? Facebook was just facing a penalty of, $5 billion from the FTC? They hardly blinked.
Yeah.
So how do you establish something that's
that's
going to be effective?
Yeah, that's a question that I would want to have answered by some of the people that have been working on these issues. I haven't. And it's interesting. I only got involved last year, and there's no one really working on this issue, right? And I'm not an attorney. I haven't been on the Hill that long, but I can recognize a problem when I see it, and this is a problem. And one of the things I would love to see is dealing with law enforcement. We can't say, hey, Microsoft, Amazon, you can't develop this technology. I don't think we should do that. But we can say to law enforcement agencies, you cannot use this data. If you do, if we come to the conclusion that they can, then we can say, okay, you can only use it in these instances. You can only use it with these data sets. You can't enter sketches into the system. You can't use celebrity mugshots or celebrity photos. We can put restrictions. And that's what they've done in when it comes to police body cameras, and I think it's reasonable.
So you're not saying you want to take this tool away from law enforcement entirely. You just want to make sure they're using it properly. Am I correct here?
I think correct. And first, I haven't decided what steps to actually take, and that's what some of the discussions are about. If the hearings produce a situation where I think I'm still worried about it, then I might say the moratorium on the use of facial recognition for law enforcement might be appropriate, and I might back that. But I haven't determined that as the course of action yet.
We're going to be taking your questions in just a minute, so get your thoughts together on that. We've talked a lot about governmental use of facial recognition, but it's all over in the private sector as well, isn't it?
It is.
And is that of concern to you? And how do you get a handle on that?
I know that there's, for my personal opinion, it's not as big of a concern as it is for the law enforcement aspect of it. But if I walk into a store and it recognizes me, and then it takes my information, but it tries to sell me like a pair of jeans I don't like, that's not going to bother me too much. It's really the interaction with law enforcement, or is it tracking me when it comes to exercising my First Amendment right to protest, freedom of speech. That's more concerning for me. But I know the arguments that people say that your face is going to become like your fingerprint, right? And do you want that information out there? What responsibilities do the private sector have of these companies when it comes to breaches of their data? If there is a breach, can they be held liable for your information getting out there? Those are good questions, and I don't have the answers to them.
We didn't touch on border security. A little bit later, we're going to be talking to someone from DHS. They say, hey, we've got to know who's coming into the country, and this gives us an ability to screen, perhaps match with photographs that are in the terrorist databases. Do you endorse that use of facial recognition?
I haven't decided, and it depends. On the borders, I'm a little bit more open. You don't have a right necessarily to just go on to a flight without people knowing who you are, but also people opt in, right? If you're crossing the border, you're sort of opting in to coming into this country. At the same time, when you're going to take a plane, I signed up for Clear. I use Clear, but I opted in for the convenience of getting through. But the question is, my data, what are they going to do with it? Are they allowed to sell it? Are they allowed to, or is it just for that particular use? Terms of agreement, let's face it, most of us don't read the fine print when it comes to...
We don't understand the fine print.
And most of us don't even read it to see if we understand it or not. So I think those are legitimate questions to have, but we got to have those we have to have those discussions on those questions.
We have a few moments here to take some questions from the audience. There are a couple of folks with microphones out in the audience. I believe I see someone right over here. If you could give us your name and your affiliation as well as your question, that would be great.
Hi, my name is Nicole Coomber. I am an associate clinical professor at the University of Maryland Business School. I want to thank you first for your candor. Thank you so much for being here, Congressman. I wanted to ask, you mentioned that a lack of diversity in technology shows up in their products. And so I wanted to see if you had thoughts on how we can improve the lack of diversity in technology, but also what are some other products that you've seen where you think this is maybe not quite as harmful as resulting in death, like facial recognition, but maybe some other areas where it's affecting the products that we use.
No, good question. That was a statement that I heard from a panelist at South by Southwest, and it did strike me as true. At the same time, when you look at the products that are being developed, they sometimes don't seem to appeal. I don't have any specifics off the top of my head. This is what I've been focusing on. But I think that in order to get more diversity in tech, you have to do more kind of STEM outreach to particular communities. You have to have specific targets to hire specific individuals. You can have what they call the Rooney Rule, which I didn't know what it was until last year, where you interview a person from a woman for every position at the top, or you interview a minority for every position at the top. Doesn't mean
what the NFL does with coaches.
Yeah, it doesn't mean that they get it, but they open up that possibility. So it is a potential. Most people that are people of color, are lower income, working class. They don't often go to the schools that have these kind of programs, STEM, computer science, so they're less likely to get into that. Greater investment in those programs in the schools might help. But diversity in tech is something that people have claimed that it shows up in their products. On facial recognition, it has proven true. And I think that that's just because of a lack of awareness from the very, very, very beginning of the development of that technology. But those are some ideas. But off the top of my head, I can't think of all the products, but facial recognition is the number one off the top of my head.
Another question out there. Do I see any hands? Yes.
Hi, yes. My name is Andrea Muskinen, I'm Vice President of Partnerships at Partnership for a Healthier America. We work with private sector partners to provide healthier options for Americans. And so you mentioned that, for facial recognition in retail, if they're trying to sell you a pair of jeans, you don't really care about that. But what about in the grocery retail? If you're a low-income American and the grocery retail is using facial recognition to give you discounts on foods that are not healthier, is that something that would be concerned in the potential for continued health disparities with the use of this technology?
Not sure. And I'll just, the reason why is that they do that anyways, right? And there's so many, I'm a big proponent about the social determinants of health, right? Understanding that the lack of access to grocery stores where they have vegetables and produce of all types at affordable cost have an impact. Where people live have an impact on their health. I get that, but at the same time, I'm not sure if that is my biggest concern when it comes to this issue of facial recognition. It doesn't mean that it's not a concern, it's just not my biggest concern. But the social determinants of health are still a big deal. I get that. We just had a hearing on it last week.
I think we have time for one more quick question right here.
Hi, good morning. My name is John. I work at a software company. And just a slightly intentionally provocative question for you. First of all, thank you for being here. And what I'd like to know is, why is it legal for software companies to use data provided by minors, by people who are under 18 years old and therefore can't do all the stuff that adults can do, like sign contracts? Why is it legal for companies to make money using their data?
I have no idea.
Is this for
This,
fresh?
like, no, honestly, I really don't. But it is a good question, right? We've seen some uses of. I heard of a test of like coming up with some of a data set when it came to images, and and this is something that we're going to look into, that it was images of victims of sexual abuse, mugshots of crime scenes, right? And we have to ask ourselves, is that also legitimate uses of those images, right? I don't have the answers to those questions yet. I think it's something that we all have to have a discussion around, and then hopefully we'll come to some logical conclusion. But there is no easy answer of like, yes, no, this is right, this is wrong. It is really bringing up those concerns and having that debate. I think a lot of, and as I mentioned before, I'm not anti-tech, right? But at the same time, when it comes to big issues, like your right to be able to walk down the street and not have anybody know who you are, I think it still matters in this country. It should matter in this country. No, we're not China, and I thank God that we're not China. But there should be some limitations to protect those individuals' rights. We're not there, so watch the hearing on Wednesday, because there's going to be a lot of discussion between the Republicans, and these are far right-wing Republicans, and far left Democrats. And I'm curious to see what the questions and the answers are.
And we'll be watching. Congressman, thank you so much for this conversation.
Thank you
Appreciate
so
it.
much.
Thank you.